All right. Well, I'm here with Stephen Hicks, and this is going to be a fun podcast. That We're going to be talking about education and the purpose of education, and higher education, universities, what's going on in the universities today. And Stephen Hicks, you're a pretty well known guy, but for those people who don't know who you are, do you want to kind of give an introduction to who you are and what you do and that sort of thing?
Mm, sure. Well, I'm a philosopher by training. I was born and raised in Canada, did my undergraduate in Canada.
Hmm.
I then came to the US for grad school in philosophy
Hmm.
and ended up getting my professor job in the US. Jobs are
Hmm.
scarce for philosophers and have been here ever since. I do a lot of philosophy of education, which I think is what
Hmm.
in part led to this invitation to your
Yeah.
podcast. But more broadly than that, I am very interested in what I think of as intellectual history, how
Hmm.
ideas are developed and how they are influential across generations, often
Hmm.
modified and blended and integrated with other
Hmm.
ideas. And so, in many cases, I'm interested in how contemporary issues
Hmm.
that often we might think is a new and fresh issue, but nonetheless, we are arguing about it inside a framework that was developed some generations earlier. And in many
Hmm.
cases, knowing that that framework and where it came from is illuminating.
Hmm. Gotcha. Yeah, and I mean, I think this is going to be interesting because I mean, the education. So I guess I'll give a little bit of background for myself, for you, just so you know where I'm
Mm,
coming from as it relates to education. Like I grew up in the Madison, Wisconsin area, very progressive. Went to the public school system here growing up, and like barely graduated high school. I had kind of gotten sick of raising my hand to go to the bathroom and things like that by the time I was 15. And I just and on top of that, I had, I'm a Christian, so I had some theological and philosophical disagreements with the ways in which they were teaching and the things that they were teaching. And so I
sure.
I, I
Yeah.
just kind of fell through the cracks, and that has always bothered me because I love learning, but I didn't feel like I was ever able to be successful in the education system, the American public
Right.
education
No.
system. And so
No.
so this is like a thing I'm passionate about, and I'm there's a lot to talk about
So
here. But
yeah. So you're catching up and doing a self-education journey
yeah,
now.
at least
Yeah.
trying to. Yeah, I'm trying to read as
Well,
much as I
yeah.
can and talk to
No,
different
that's a
people.
beautiful thing. Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
for sure. And so one of the interesting things that I know about you that maybe we can start by talking about this is obviously I think you've been on the Jordan Peterson podcast, and you're part of his new academy, the Peterson Academy, which I've heard a little bit about here and there from him. And it seems like he's taking a bit of a different approach to higher education through this. What do you know about this? And how are you a part of this thing? And
Yeah.
maybe that can open up a whole different, a whole new conversation.
Yeah, well, yeah, I am part of the faculty of the new Peterson Academy, which is launching this year, very soon
Mm.
actually. Well, I think the strategic thinking behind this, which I'm not a part of,
Mhm.
but the idea is in part technological to say now that we are in the 21st century, especially, there's all of these wonderful communications technologies.
Mm.
How can we redo education to take advantage of the best of the technologies that are out there?
Mhm.
That's not to say that the old ways of doing education are going to go by the by,
Sure.
but nonetheless, there are many new experiments that need to be done with the new technologies, distance
Mm.
learning, integration of video, sound, right, and so on.
Mm.
So I think that's one part of it. Another part of it is driven by economic factors. Right now, the models of education, public school education or government school education, and higher education, very expensive
Mhm.
delivery models.
Yeah.
And that is one of the things that's led to the student debt crisis of many students. So, just purely economically, how can one deliver high quality education at a much reduced cost?
Mm.
And again, the technologies are going to enable us to do
Mhm.
that. And I think a third part of it is philosophical, about philosophy of education, folding into that political. Much of current education is not really education. It's a kind of I have my ideological agenda, and I'm going to force feed it upon my captive students. And that can be a philosophical position, broadly speaking, but one can have then a theological agenda, a political agenda, various sorts of agendas. And to the extent that one is doing that, one's not really educating. And unfortunately, in our generation, we have serious problems across the board in the now
Mm.
institutions of education. So I think part of the strategic thinking of the Peterson Academy is to say uh,
Mm.
education should not be about force feeding students one's agenda.
Mm.
That in some sense it should be the liberal education ideal.
Mm.
Students need to learn some stuff, and professors should have things to profess, but at the same time, students are ultimately going to be responsible for thinking for themselves, making up
Mm.
their own minds. And particularly on all of the issues that are controversial, and there's lots and lots of those,
Mm.
any education that only delivers one side of an argument or one side of a position on an issue that everyone knows is controversial, that's a form of miseducation. So, quite
Mm.
consciously, Peterson and his team are choosing people who are from different parts of the political spectrum, different parts of the theological
Oh,
spectrum, different
nice.
parts of the broad, more broadly
Yeah.
ideological and philosophical spectrum, so that students get exposed to different voices,
Yeah,
so to speak.
for
But then
sure.
at the same time, you mentioned that Jordan Peterson has for many years now had his podcast,
Mm.
and so that's been part of his on self education in all of the issues, because he's trying to be a more universal thinker
Mm.
outside of his areas of expertise, and to integrate that with his areas of expertise. So he's been, so to speak, gathering names of people he thinks are the best in the world in all sorts of different areas,
Mm.
and where possible, getting them to come and teach a course in their area of expertise
Mm.
at the academy. So in my case, I do philosophy, but I'm teaching two courses for them. One on modern philosophy that basically
Mm.
begins in the 1600s, what we call modern philosophy, that begins with Francis Bacon, Rene Descartes, and so forth, and then going through the big name philosophers and the major issues up until the 20th century. And then a second course on postmodern
Mm.
philosophy, as postmodernism in the last couple of generations has been the most vigorous philosophical
Mhm.
framework, hotly contested, but nonetheless, what are the main philosophers' ideas that fed into the postmodern package, and then several also philosophers who have been challenging various
Mm.
elements of the postmodern package. So essentially, what's been going on philosophically for the last century, since 1900 or so.
Mm.
So I was quite honored to be invited to teach those two courses.
Yeah, that's awesome. I want to break this down a little bit because I'm interested in hearing what you have to say about this. Is it like, as I've seen education move, people are like, okay, we have the internet, we've got all of these ways in distributing information now. So why not use that in the education system to obviously bring education to a wider range of people who might not get it? I mean, there's lectures all over YouTube. Even if you don't want to actually get a degree, just go to YouTube and you can learn
Yeah,
anything.
yeah,
And
yeah,
and that's
beautiful.
really cool and that's really great. And I'm not sure exactly where I stand here, but is there anything to like the interpersonal nature of education? And that I think back to I think it was Aristotle who took his pupils out into nature. And is that Aristotle? Am I thinking of the
Well,
right
yeah,
guy?
yeah. Aristotle was a great
Okay.
biologist. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
And
yeah,
there's like always, I guess throughout history, there's an interpersonal relationship between the professor and the pupil or the learner. And I'm just wondering, do you think that the technological aspect that people are moving towards, education systems are moving towards, is there, could that hinder any learning or
mhm,
any, because I think about how we're having a conversation right now, and people are going to listen to this later. People aren't going to have the ability to do what I'm doing, to be able to ask you to follow up on
right.
what your statement
Yes,
is and things like that. And so there's,
that's right.
you miss out on that relationship that I think might be I don't know if it's fundamental to education, but it's very important at the very least.
Right.
So what do you
Yeah.
think about that?
Well, I think that, yeah, the one technology cannot do everything in education. So if we have our
Mhm.
conception of what it is to be a fully educated person,
Mhm.
and then in an ongoing fashion to continue, right, oneself to educate. And yeah, as you're pointing out, YouTube lectures or other platforms, those mostly are going to be one-way directional information.
Mhm.
So they're not going to have the dialogic element, right? Or
Mhm.
it's going to be in
Mhm.
truncated form in the comments section or
Mhm.
something like that.
Right.
So then you say, okay, fine, but the trade-off then is if you have a traditional classroom or a traditional college, to say, or university where I teach my Rockford University,
Mhm.
you will have professors who can then engage in dialogue, but at the same time, your professors are competent, but they're not necessarily the best person in the world on various things. So
Right. Right.
I, for example, I know, and I teach Thomas Aquinas, for example, and I can do a
Mm.
good job teaching Thomas Aquinas, but I'm not the most expert Thomist in the universe.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
the benefit then would be to say, how could we perhaps blend
Mm.
to say we want to have a college space or a university space where there's a professor like me with a group of students,
Mm.
and we will do all of the dialoguing element, and that's great, that's wonderful,
Mm.
and we can do Socratic things and various other kinds of formal and informal models as well.
Yeah.
But is there a way to supplement that with saying who is, in fact, the best and most dramatic person on Aquinas in the world? Get
Yeah.
that person into a studio, have him or her deliver a series of lectures on Aquinas, and those
Mm.
can then also be available to me.
For
And then
sure.
from my perspective, then as a philosopher, well, let's do that also with Plato, with Aristotle, with the
Mm.
Sophists, with Marcus Aurelius, with Augustine. So you build up a library,
Mm.
and it would be a curated library of the best people in the world on every major issue and the best people in the world on every major person.
Mhm.
And for many people, that will be a dream education, right? If
Right.
I'm a
Right.
self-starting person and I can sit down and think about stuff and make my own notes and I can do some side
Mhm.
research and so on, that could very well be a very complete education. But
Mm.
you're right, then to say it often is valuable to have students, particularly when they're younger, having discussions with a professor in perhaps
Mm.
Socratic form, because you can cover a lot of ground
Mm.
and go where you want in a Socratic discussion. So that's extraordinarily valuable. We also know that students learn a huge amount from each other. Often they're a little less intimidated talking with each other and arguing about things. So maybe take the professor out of the equation and just have groups of students. And I always like to joke that philosophy is really a drinking sport. Remembering
Mm.
my own college and university
Mhm.
days, where you go for a beer with your classmates, and you
Mhm.
argue about stuff for the next 6 hours until three
Yeah.
o'clock in the morning, right, or
Right.
whatever, and you learn a huge amount of stuff. So yes,
Mhm.
the interpersonal is important there, and so I think this is one of the beautiful things about the generation that we are in right now,
Mm.
where we're thinking about the technologies
Mm.
and what are their strengths and what are their limitations. And we don't really know until we experiment with them for
Right.
the next 20 years or so, and then try various blendings with all of the
Mhm.
traditional educational methods that have been developed over the centuries. And I think for the next couple of generations, we will be exploring, and there will be a
Mm.
thousand failed experiments, but also there will be 100 very successful experiments,
Right.
and so on. But I'm bullish on it. I think this is only for the positive and open-ended
Mhm.
net benefits what we're doing right now.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's been really cool. I mean, to watch through, I've watched through some of the Genesis lectures from Jordan Peterson specifically. This have like millions and millions of you, like things that just would have never been possible unless you were to write them down into a book and then publish them. But even so, people aren't reading at the rate that they're watching or listening and on online. And so it's like yeah, that it has been cool to see some of that stuff blow up and see people be able. I mean, even the Joe Rogan podcast is a good example of like
Oh yeah,
people will sit down and listen to some Joe Rogan talk to somebody for like 4 hours, and it's like
yeah,
that's
yeah,
wild. That's a long time, you know. So it's, I mean, that's
yeah.
all great. I think that's all really good. I think it's expanding the mind, and it's helping people think
Sure,
through
that's
long,
right. Yeah.
complex topics. So
But
yeah,
at the same time, there are lots of new experimental methods, being developed. There are, new colleges starting that are devoted to Socratic style, and they
yeah,
say, this will be expensive, but we want to have you come into classroom having read stuff and ready to talk with a dozen of your peers and
hmm,
a guiding professor, and that's what your
yeah,
education will be. And lots of blendings, every possible blending. There's a new college trying to do that blending. And the issue that you're talking about, how much of it do we do in bricks and mortar types of
hmm,
institutions, or what we think of as a standard college classroom? How much of it should perhaps be a more Aristotelian model,
hmm,
where you actually are walking around in the park or in the woods and talking about stuff and actually interacting with nature. So all of those
right.
experiments are beautiful.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I think this can kind of lead maybe into the question about actually what education is. Maybe I jumped the gun talking about the methods in which we can get education out there, but what like what actually is education and what is the purpose of education? So I guess I want to start kind of with that open-ended question and see what your take is on that, and then maybe we go back and forth a little bit and try to figure out what it is. 'Cause I mean, this has been an
Yeah,
interesting thing for me growing up. It's like, what is the purpose of this education, or what am I trying to
right.
gain here?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah, what do you think?
All right. Well, okay. My approach to this is to say education primarily is about younger people. Right?
Mm,
So if you think human beings are an unusual species in
mm,
that the amount of time that it takes for a human being from infancy to grow up to adulthood and be ready to function in the world as an adult.
mm,
For human beings, it's at least a dozen years.
mm.
And now we actually would think it's cruel if you were to take a kid out of school and say, "Okay, kid, now you
Right.
go out and look after yourself as an adult, right, in the world." So typically, we're really thinking about the first 18 years of
Mm,
life. And the reason for that is that we as human beings, our physical development is much slower and
mm,
our psychological development is much slower. And that is both a cost, but it also opens up lots of benefits. So,
mm,
by contrast, if you think of almost any other animal species, at most it's like 2 years
mm.
until when the baby, whatever it is
Right.
born. And
Yeah.
then by the time it's 2 years old, it's a full adult and it knows everything. It's got all of the skill set that it needs to go
Hmm.
out and live as an adult of that species. Sometimes it's 1 year, sometimes it's a few months,
Yeah.
and so on.
Yeah.
So
Look, we've got a 1-year-old right now, and he's just not ready to go out on his
he's
own
not
like
ready. Yeah, okay.
that. Right. Right. There you go.
Even though what's happened in that 1 year already
What
is
fun.
astonishing and
Right. Right.
amazing, right?
Right.
Okay,
Totally.
so
Yeah.
good. So what this then means is for us as adults, as we are aware of this long developmental process, and we can just do it randomly. Some animal species do teach their young this way. They're kind of opportunistic, waiting for the right time for some lesson or other to be taught,
Hmm.
and then that's taught. But
Right.
we, because of the huge amount of resources and the huge amount of time, we need to think about this strategically.
Hmm.
That is to say, we need, so to speak, an 18-year plan. And if I'm a parent, then parents do think, if they're decent parents, and this is
Mhm.
most of them, about education in a systematic form. And what that
Mhm.
means is they are having some sort of a conception of what it is by the time someone is 18, what they should be like, what their physical development should be like, what their psychological development should be like. Just to start with those
Yeah.
two broad categories. And so that then is to say, I want the kid to have a healthy body and I want the kid to have a healthy mind.
Mhm.
And then you start developing a long list of all of the things that go into all of those things. I
Mm.
need good good food for the body, but also good food for the mind, right?
Mm,
And the kid needs to learn all of these physical skills, but then also all of these psychological skills and
mm,
all of these good physical habits, but then all of these good psychological habits. And so the list gets long and so forth.
mm,
But it is by the time the kid, say, is 18, and we say, all right, at that point, you're done with your education, you go out and you live your life as a human being. The kid is now, as an adult, ready and able to do that. And
mhm,
so education then is going to be everything from 0 to age 18 that
mm.
we do thoughtfully to take that kid along that process. Now that's a lot because
Right.
we start to say, well, there's thousands and thousands of things I want the kid to know. There are hundreds and hundreds of skills I want the kid to have,
Mhm,
dozens and dozens of habits I want the kid to
mhm,
have, and
mm,
each of them it comes in varying degrees of complexity. Sometimes the kid's ready for that at age 3, but sometimes not until age 8, sometimes
mm,
not until age 14. So there's
mm,
the physical developmental things and the psychological developmental things. So
mm,
part of the answer then to the question of education is that you have to start off as a philosopher, I think.
mhm.
So
Yeah,
you have
for
to
sure.
answer the question: what is what is human life all about?
Mhm,
Right? What do I want this kid to? What kind of life do I want this kid to live? And that's a
mhm,
philosophical question.
mhm,
And what are the good things that I want the kid to be able to enjoy? What are the bad things I want the kid
mm,
to stay away from? So there's good and bad in there. And I have to know something about not only philosophy, but I also have to know something about biology. So all of the nutritional issues and all of the health
mm,
issues for me as a parent to raise the child
mm,
to grow physically, and there's a lot
mhm,
of biology that is going on there, and that it's staged out. There's developmental things. What happens, cognitively in the first couple of years as the brain starts to develop, and how
right.
do just even before we say the kid is able to write, if we want to say, well, writing is important, but there are still
Mhm,
physical developmental things with
right,
respect to the hand
right.
and coordinations and eye hand coordinations, and
Mhm,
those don't come online until a certain age. So all of those physical developmental things, and
mm,
then puberty is another big one that
right.
that kicks through.
Yeah,
And so educating before and after puberty. And then the same thing holds psychologically. So you might say, yeah, we want the kids to be able to do algebra and functions and relations and maybe some calculus before
right,
they go out into the world. But you can't do calculus at age 3. Right?
right,
So you have to start with numbers and then arithmetic and some geometry, and then you're ready to do algebra and trigonometry,
mhm,
and then you're ready to do maybe some calculus. But all of these things take time because partly it's brain development, but also it's
mhm,
psychological development. And in many cases, the skills and the knowledge are cumulative. So
mm,
education then is, and this would be just a rough and ready definition, right? The strategic plan that educators develop for young people to take them from 0, infancy, to 18, say, full
mhm,
maturity,
mhm.
and everything that goes in there. That's education.
So would you include in there any moral aspect in that? Like I think about during COVID, there was and I don't know where you land on this, but I felt like there was a lot of scientists and people who had gone through the education system. We'll just say like the general American education system from age whatever 6 to 18 and or probably like 26. They're like PhD people. Anyway, they who knew the methods of science but didn't have the moral backbone to say the truth, and that those and I've noticed that in the education system, at least what I've seen, is that there's been some sort of detachment of the methods of education from the morals of human life or existence or whatever. That those two things can be detached from each other, and that you can learn the
Yeah,
methods without having the morality to undergird that. And
right.
then what happens ultimately, I think, is that you get something like the COVID situation where you have people who are willing to lie or kind of deceive or kind of make things up on some certain basis. But where would you add or would you add a moral aspect into that?
Absolutely, yes.
Sure.
Yeah. So your COVID example is a good one. And so often weaknesses in our education system are pointed out to us during crises. Right. And
Sure.
so
Right.
COVID was a crisis, and then
Yeah.
suddenly we realize that we don't have something that we need to
Yeah.
be able to deal with
Right.
this crisis. Okay.
Right.
And moral standards and
Mm.
moral courage, right, was one of the things that we did find lacking in
Mhm.
some people we wanted to step up to the plate.
Right.
Mixing my metaphors there, but to deliver not only some scientific and technological medical expertise, but also the moral wisdom that goes along with that. Now,
Yes,
there's a
you
couple
say
of
that real
things that
quick.
go
Hey,
ahead.
did you watch Oppenheimer?
Yes.
I feel like that's a somewhat of a similar example, just what you're saying. The moral
Oh yeah,
with
yeah.
the technical.
Yeah,
Yeah.
wars and is another
Yeah.
the kind of crisis that
Yeah.
arises,
Right.
or
Right.
any hugely new technological breakthrough. In that
Yeah. Right.
case, the development of nuclear power and
Yeah.
its possible weaponization. And
Yeah.
now we're talking about robotics and artificial intelligence
Right.
as
Right.
another technological breakthrough. So
Mhm.
it either raises new kinds of moral questions or just major wrinkles or
Yeah.
variations on existing ones. And we
Right.
have to rethink everything through in light of the new technological breakthrough. So that's another very good example. I think what we're dealing with in the contemporary education world is two kinds of problems about what you talk about in terms of method and morality, and that's a fine rough draft distinction to
Sure.
introduce
Sure.
there at that point. One is a philosophical problem where
Mm.
there is a kind of skepticism that has been plaguing philosophy for many centuries now
Mm.
that says there's a dichotomy between fact statements and value statements.
Mm.
Right? That we can talk about the facts, but the facts are amoral. And if you're
Mm.
only talking about the facts, there's no way to moralize, right, on the basis of those. And so often it goes the other way that we start with morals that we
Mm.
think are important, right, correct in some way, but we don't see how those can be factually based. And so we then say, well, morals are just matters of faith or subjective preferences or
Mm.
arbitrary inventions or emotional reactions. And we think of emotions again as separate from facts and reasoning and science and so on. So
Yeah.
there has been this whole dichotomy that
Mm.
several of the major schools of philosophy have bought into in various forms that has shaped much of modern philosophical thinking.
Mm.
So, how you get from one to the other and whether they can be integrated is a big philosophical issue. But
Mm.
what that then leads to the extent that you think that the dichotomy is true, is that you think what will be rational and what is emotional, right?
Mm.
Or what is true and what is significant, right?
Mm.
Or what is scientific and what is valuable, that you're talking different languages
Mm.
and that there's no way to get between those two. And then that will then lead to people who think, well, no, I'm about reason, I'm about logic, I'm about science, I'm about the facts. They will then say, to the extent that I think I have to be about those things, I can't be talking about values and meaning and significance
Mm.
and ethics, because that's a different kind of language that's alien to my area of expertise. And then
Mm.
at the same time, you'll have lots and lots of people who will then say, I think my values are important. Meaning and
Mm.
significance is important, and being emotionally invested in
Mm.
things is what's significant to me. But they will take the lesson that that means that they need to be non-rational,
Mm.
non-scientific, illogical, and not to see the facts as having any bearing on
Mm.
the value part of their life. And so you end up with two camps or two tribes that are divorced from each other.
Mm.
And that's a big problem in intellectual life and in cultural life.
Have you
So,
read the?
so let me just
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just
Sorry.
draw a line here. So the example that you pointed out about COVID, where you then
Mm,
had a large number of people who were great at the science
mm,
of immunology. They're very great on the technologies, and they knew what all of the mRNA vaccines could
right.
potentially do, and so forth. But they had zero training in
Mm,
anything to do with policy, with making judgments of good and bad, right and wrong. And
right.
so they were not able to do so. Right? And
Hmm.
then at the same time, you had large numbers of people who were willing to say what should be done, who thought they were quite competent at being able to say all of those things about what should be done, but not knowing much about the science or the technology. And that
Mm,
dichotomy is a very bad place for us to be.
right. Did you have you ever read the book The Pilgrim's Regress by C.S. Lewis?
No, not that one.
So it's like okay, so in it's C.S. Lewis's kind of conversion to Christianity, but he says it as like in dream form, and the character in it as he travels further north, things become more rational, to the point of like a coldness and a staleness. And as he travels more south, things become really romantic to the point of like almost like postmodern ambiguity. Like nothing is true, nothing is real, everything's
Okay,
so
so that's a
expressive.
nice literary romanticism way
Yeah,
of having the dichotomy, right?
yeah, exactly. That's kind of what I was
So
thinking
cold
about.
versus warm, right? Rational
Hmm.
versus emotional. And
Yeah.
the versus is the important word there. If you think as a matter philosophically that
Mm.
versus is right, that it's an either or, that there's a hard line, then that's the thing that sets you up for the problems, in my view.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. And I think what he was kind of saying is that like towards the center of that when you get to like the center, when you're not totally south or totally north, there's a chasm, and you can't get across the chasm unless this lady
Right,
named Mother Kirk takes you. Mother Kirk
right.
is a representation of the church, and the chasm is a represent. You take you takes you
Yeah,
to
so
Christ.
that's a nice literary statement of, yeah, and the
Hmm.
chasm language is exactly the either or the
Yeah.
dichotomy, right?
Hmm.
That you can talk one kind of language, but it's a different kind of language than the other kind of language over here. So we can talk the
Sure.
language of science or the language of religion. We can
Hmm.
talk the language of facts or we can talk the language of values, right?
Hmm.
And so forth.
So so are you, I want to clarify. So are you kind of in the camp of you have to talk about them all separately? Or are you saying that you have to actually figure out where they come together? Or I guess what was your
Right. No, right now we're just diagnosing, right, the
totally,
problem.
totally.
And what
Yeah.
I'm saying is, right, that is a problem that
Hmm.
has been widespread in
Hmm.
philosophy for
Hmm.
several
Gotcha.
centuries
Right.
now. And many of the leading schools of philosophy,
Hmm.
right, however much they might disagree about lots of things,
Sure.
will
Right.
agree on that particular chasm or
Hmm.
that particular dichotomy.
Hmm.
Right? Now you ask about me in
Yes. Yeah.
particular,
Right.
right? I think that dichotomy is a false dichotomy, right?
Okay.
That there is no chasm, right, so to speak. Now, I do
Hmm.
think, if you start philosophically in some places, you will run into a chasm. You make an early mistake, it will lead you to
Sure.
chasm thinking. I kind of like that as a metaphor. Or if you start over here and you make commitments here, you won't be able to get to over here. But I do think
Sure.
as a matter of philosophy, I'll just state what the conclusion is. I don't think value statements are a different kind of statement from fact statement. That value statements are a kind of fact statement. It's a
Hmm.
rather than saying there's one species here and another species over here.
Yeah.
Like the broader thing is there are fact statements, and some of those fact statements are value statements.
Hmm.
So that then is to say, since you have a more theologically informed audience,
Hmm.
that's would be then to say this is a more Aristotle Aquinas approach to
Sure.
philosophy. That's mine versus a more Platonic Augustinian
Hmm.
approach, which is a kind of chasm philosophy, right? We have this
Hmm.
world, but instead of this language over here and this language over here, they will put it this way. There's
Hmm.
lots of facts in this world, but they are not moral facts. They are amoral facts.
Right.
And then, or they are about the physical world.
Yeah.
And then the chasm is that there's another world that is above, it's
Mm.
higher, it's
Yeah.
better. And that's where we find morals, right? You don't find
Mm.
morals in this lower world.
Mm.
And they are spiritual, or they are of the
Mm.
soul. They are not of the body. They are not
Right.
of the material world.
Mm.
So that's a different kind of chasm thinking, but it's arrayed on a vertical.
Where
So,
did you
but
come to
that was
that?
to put it, and to say there's the Platonic
Oh.
Augustinian tradition, and that
Mhm.
has its modern forms, but there's also the Aristotle Aquinas tradition that sees them from the beginning as integrated value
Sure.
and fact statements.
So yeah, so where did you how did you come to being in the Aristotle the intertwined camp, I guess? So how did you come to get to that point?
Uh, well, I would say in my philosophy of education, I read both sides of the arguments and came to
Mhm.
agree with those who were on the no chasm right side of the line. So in that tradition, right, you would have people like Aristotle, Aquinas in various ways, John Locke to a certain extent
Okay.
on some issues. He's a little more complex there. A little bit later, someone like Friedrich Nietzsche in
Okay.
different ways. Obviously, I've got big problems with Nietzsche in lots of ways, but on this
Sure.
issue, he doesn't see a dichotomy there. In the 20th century, Ayn Rand, and
Huh.
then a little bit later, Philippa Foot. So they are all in that
Gotcha.
non-chasm uh,
Huh.
uh, uh, approach.
So
So
as this
let
oh,
me
go
just
ahead.
give you one quick and dirty example. Human beings, as we've been
Sure.
talking about, are very complicated. But suppose we weren't talking about humans, and suppose we were talking about some animal species. I would say, does it make
Mhm.
sense to say that um, uh, fish being in water is good for a fish, and a fish being taken out of water and put on dry land is bad for the fish?
Hmm.
And quite commonsensically, we would say
Right.
yes, right?
Yeah.
It's
Right.
good for a fish to be in water and swimming around, and it's bad for
Mhm.
a fish to be on land.
Right.
But notice what we're doing there. We're using good and bad language.
Hmm.
And we're saying some things are naturally good for the fish, and some things are naturally bad for the fish.
Hmm.
And we say, well, why is it good for a fish to be in water? And
Right.
it's not that we're just emotionally making some commitment to the fish lifestyle, right? Or
Right.
that I'm waiting for some divine revelation about what fish moral commandments should be. Thou shalt swim in the water,
Yeah.
right,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And it's not just a subjective preference. I happen to like fish swimming in the water because that's how
Mm.
I was raised or whatever. No, fish are a biological organism. They have certain needs. They have certain
Mm.
capacities in the water. They can exercise their capacities for swimming, the way their gills work to
Mm.
get the oxygen which they need that happens to be in the water into their system so they can do what they need biologically.
Mm.
And so we're just naturalistically and factually and
Mm.
scientifically describing the fish's lifestyle. And for the fish to stay alive and function as a fish, this is what it needs to do, needs
Mhm.
capacities, resources, and so on. And so the moral language or the language of good and bad just falls out of that quite
Mm.
naturalistically. And what we
Mm.
mean by saying it's bad for the fish is, you take the fish and you throw it on the dry land.
Mhm.
Well, it cannot exercise its capacities
Right.
for swimming to make
Mm.
the water flow over its gills. And so it
Mhm.
can't get the oxygen that it needs from
Mhm.
the environment in order to maintain its life functions. And that's bad for the
Mhm.
fish because the fish is going to die, right?
Mhm.
So there's some
Mhm.
sort of standard of natural living and some sort of standard of death that are grounding
Mm.
naturally our distinction between the good and the bad. Now, that's
Yeah.
a very basic example, but that's how
Right.
the Aristotle, right, Aristotelian approach, because Aristotle
Yeah.
was a great biologist as well as a great philosopher. So people in that tradition will then say,
Mm.
yeah, we start by looking at nature and living things. Some have to do certain things to stay alive, and if they
Right.
don't, they will die. And that grounds the distinction between good and bad. And then
Yeah.
it just becomes more and more complicated depending on how complicated the
Mm,
species is. And the reason why we
mm,
find it very difficult for human beings is that we are just incredibly complicated, our
right.
lifestyle. And so, in many cases, the very complicated things that are part of our life, we have not yet figured out what sort of
Mhm.
natural facts would ground those. So,
Right.
there's a long philosophical but very interesting discussion to be
Yeah.
had there.
Yeah. No,
But all of
that's
this comes
interesting.
back to your point about education, that
Right.
if you
Yeah.
come to education and you think that facts and values are, there's a chasm between them, that's going to shape how you do education. And if you
Mhm.
think facts are integrated with values, then that's also going to shape how you do education.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, I mean, it felt like growing up that there was that dichotomy, like the idea that things are amoral, or that there's no morality connected to the things that I'm learning, I mean, I even think about this as it relates to the origin story. I mean, as we are in biology, growing up, you have you get. I mean, I got taught the evolutionary process and the Big Bang as a origin, and a lot of people agree with that. Okay, but like from a, let's just say, like a fundamentalist Christian perspective, the origin of the world is not the evolutionary Big Bang perspective, and yet those two things have deep philosophical and moral uh, realities tied to them. So if you're going to take
Yes.
an evolutionary position, then that that human beings evolved through millions and millions of years, you're going to have to take that all the way down to the moral ethics that evolved through those millions and billions of years as well. And then,
Right.
where God created, the Christian perspective, God created the moral ethics. And so I was always insanely confused that it was like, no, this is just, they would say, Andy, this is the science. This isn't the morality. And I was like, but the science that you're telling me has moral implications. So how am I
Oh,
supposed
yeah.
to deal with these
Right.
things? It's obviously I'm venting a little bit, but it was always just very
No, no,
confusing.
this is exactly right what a thoughtful person needs to grapple with, right, on those
Sure.
issues. So if you say, right, one story is the Big Bang story about the origins of the universe and how we came to be what we are, and
Hmm.
another story is a kind of Judeo-Christian
Hmm.
creation story, right,
Hmm.
right from the very beginning, they are making different metaphysical assumptions,
Yeah.
and those very different metaphysical assumptions down the road have very different implications for ethics. And both of those philosophical systems worked out will then have different implications for education. Because
Hmm.
all educators are going to say at some level, well, we want to teach the truth.
Hmm.
But what is the truth? Is it the evolutionary story, in which case your education will go in that direction? And it will seem irresponsible to you to teach things that you think are ridiculous and not true.
Hmm.
But then the same thing starts over here. If you start with the creation story and you think that's the truth, then when you get that all worked out, you're going to say, my responsibility as an educator is to teach the truth. And
Hmm.
so you will teach that, and it will seem irresponsible to you to
Hmm.
teach what you think is the false model as well. So you
And
end
I
up with
yeah.
a dichotomized culture and dichotomized education systems.
And I think that this is playing itself out in the transgender, or I mean, going as far as the transhumanist movement, in that people, I don't know where you stand on the evolution thing, but I'm not convinced of it. So let's just, I want you to tear this apart, if and tell me what I'm wrong about here. But that it feels like the evolutionary perspective, like logically, or maybe logically, it's taking you to that transhumanist conclusion, that the next step in the evolution is towards a transhumanist reality or world, that everybody interacts with each other transhumanly, and that we're not connected necessarily to our biological functions and things like that. And that seems where that's going. And so, I mean, that's just an example that I thought of in my head, that it's like, okay, that is a philosophical and moral implication of what I think is the evolutionary worldview. Now,
Mm.
what do you think about that? Is that kind of wild or out there?
I would say transhumanism is one possible direction that an evolutionary understanding
Mm-hmm.
of the world and an evolution of humans could go.
Right.
and it's partly speculative, and it takes certain developments in sciences and technology, and
Mm-hmm.
it extrapolates those. But
Mm-hmm.
there are always lots of different ways to
Mm-hmm.
extrapolate. And even within transhumanism, I think there are a number of different or sub schools of
Yeah.
transhumanism, and
Right.
so I don't want to do too much speculation. But there is an interesting packaging that goes on. So if you take the evolutionary model, one of the interesting ethical implications is the idea that we are improving and getting better over time.
Mm.
Already, that's controversial, right? But then to say, we started as a less developed species with fewer capacities, and
Mm.
as we go along, partly through natural selection and also through our own choices of doing cultural selection,
Yeah.
we are improving, and we
Mm.
now then have the capacity to improve ourselves in various ways. So
Mm-hmm.
if we think, for example, we used to all be a lot shorter, now we are all getting taller, or our lifespan was 20 years, then it was 30 years, 40 years. So if
Yeah.
you think life is good, longer lifespan is better, so we are improving.
Mm.
Maybe because the world is getting more complicated, that's putting more cognitive demands on us.
Mm.
And so we're getting smarter. And so, built into all of that way of thinking is that we are starting from a good but less good place, and we are becoming better and better.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that's one. I'd say that's controversial, but then that's one
Yeah.
possible right evolutionary arc. But that also is a smack in the face of one of the versions of the traditional creation model, because
Mm.
the traditional creation model has things going in the other direction. Right? You
Right.
start with a
Right.
God who is perfectly good, and he
Right.
makes a world either that was perfect or pretty good.
Right.
Again, there are some,
Yeah.
but
It's
then
confusing
it
that the
gets
devil was in the garden. That Satan
yeah,
was.
exactly.
Right.
Where did the devil come from? But let's put
Right.
that one to the side. Right?
Yeah.
But then there were humans in the garden, and they were pretty good, but they had some weaknesses too. And
Mm.
then the story is that gets worse. They sin,
Mm-hmm.
and then they sin some more, and then there's just sin everywhere until you get to the
Mm-hmm.
generation of Noah, and the whole world is polluted.
Mm.
And right, so but then what we have though is a metaphysical view that says we start from the good, and the history of the world is a decline history of the world,
Right.
and that it's human beings who are making it worse and worse.
Mm.
And that morally, a way of framing your understanding of humans and their place in the world in terms of decline, and it's your fault as a human being, is
Mm.
very different from the way of framing the entire world, which is to say we started neutral, and we are through our great capacities becoming better and better.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so
Mm.
those two are going to collide with each other
Mm-hmm.
in
Right.
the schools, and I think they should collide with each other in
Yeah,
the
it's an
schools.
interesting thing because even when you say better and better, I think to myself, obviously, I come from the Christian perspective. Like, I think humans are. I come from a Calvinist perspective, so I like
Mm.
I'm like hardcore, like in a way. Like I think humans are depraved, and so even when we say like, okay, what's good
Well, let's
about
just be clear. You're speaking for yourself. All
yeah, yeah, for sure, for
right.
sure.
Please don't
I
include that in me, otherwise I'll take it as an insult.
no, I'll just talk about yeah. This is just true about me. So when you say about like what's good is that like that we're living longer and longer lives. Like that was just one thing where I'd say like yeah, from the other perspective, it's like we're living longer and longer lives, but for like what purpose or what reason is it?
Right.
Is it
Sure.
for the
And
sake
if you
of
combine that with human depravity, then it's going to be, well, that doesn't sound like a good thing. That's just more time for people to do evil things.
yeah, right, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. But and then from the other side, it's like no, that's more time for people to create new things and develop new
that's
opportunities
right.
for other people and to build things. So
That's
it's a
right.
very confusing thing because I'm not even. It's like yeah, like do I want to live longer in the sense like do I want to live longer as a Christian? It's very difficult because I would love to go to heaven to be with
Right.
God.
Sure.
On the other hand, I have a wife and kids, and I want to see help build their lives. You know what I mean? And so it's just
Oh yeah,
it's
no, that's a
wild.
huge value, right? So
Hmm.
yeah, the value of life on Earth is exactly right at
Hmm.
stake there. So if
Yeah.
uh, one of the implications is of the creation model, God created us for a particular purpose. We're to fulfill some roles here, but
Yeah.
really the goal is not here on earth.
Mm,
The goal is to get reunited with God and get into heaven in somehow.
mm.
And the sooner the better that happens, right, which is a natural part
Sure.
or a supernatural part of that package, then
Mm,
your estimation of life is very different, right,
mm,
from the
mhm,
kind of person who
mhm.
says, I don't think there is a heaven and a hell.
Yeah,
This is
right,
my life.
right.
And I would rather have 80 years of it than 60
Mm,
years. And I would actually
mhm,
rather have 100 years of it.
mhm.
And so life extension becomes a value because you've assessed life. Right?
Right.
So
As
life on
it.
earth becomes the most important thing,
Yeah,
and that shapes your entire value framework and then your education framework
right.
compared to the other, which is to say, not that you're completely indifferent to life on earth, but you are committed to saying, I've got my duties to do here, but the sooner I can
Mhm,
discharge those duties to get on with the real value, which is in the next world, the better.
mhm. Do you
And
think
those
that
are going
that
to collide.
yeah, I'm curious. Do you think that that affects your morals, which that affects the morals? Because we had talked about some way that the that morals are intertwined with the science, that you can kind of
Oh
in
yeah.
some way empirically
No,
find
the very
morality.
good example then would be, to take a scientifically trained person, a medical doctor,
Yeah.
and so someone comes in having suffered some terrible accident,
Uh-huh.
and if I'm a medical doctor, do I want to save this person or not save this person?
Mhm.
Now I could say, oh, this person, I could just
Mm,
not do anything. The person will die and go to heaven,
mm,
right? So I'm doing the person a favor by not
mhm,
treating them.
mhm,
Right? But from that would make sense from one moral perspective based on a certain religious perspective. The other wants to say, no, no, living longer is good, and I've got
mm,
all of this scientific and technical skill that
mhm,
hopefully would enable this person to get past this accident and live
mm,
longer. And so it becomes my moral responsibility to
mhm,
use all of my scientific training in the service of that good.
mhm,
So yes, exactly.
mhm.
That would be
Granted, I
what.
will say, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, and it also has to do with methods.
Mhm,
To come back to that one, so if you say, well, why are people sick, or why do
mhm,
bad things happen in the world? We do know one of the more physical materialists say, well, stuff happens in the material world,
mm,
and so the methods that we use when someone is damaged are going to be more material methods. We give them
mm,
surgical interventions, we give them antibiotics, right, and
mhm.
so forth.
Right.
Whereas there's another version of the Judeo Christian cosmology, I don't think this is yours, though, that basically says everything that is going wrong in the physical world is because it is out of connection to the spiritual.
Hmm. No,
And
no.
so, what you need to do anytime there's a problem in the physical world is reestablish that connection with the spiritual world. And then you
Right.
don't do materialistic stuff.
Is that
So,
more Eastern?
well, there are Christian Science, and which is a more strongly theological version. Say, when someone is
Right.
sick, you need to pray for this person more.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Right.
they will
Right.
explicitly say, you do
Right.
not do blood transfusions, you do not do surgeries, you do
Sure.
not do
Huh.
antibiotics. And they
Huh.
will see themselves as arguing from a religious, moral perspective,
Mm.
but it's based on a certain metaphysics that says the
Huh.
spiritual has primacy over the material, and that leads to certain methods.
Mm.
So yes, it
Yeah.
is, of course, yeah, very Eastern, but also, yeah, the very common notion of when someone is sick with whatever among religious people, say, yeah, I'm pray for you.
Yeah.
And
Right.
then from a more physicalistic perspective, well, how is prayer
Right.
going to do anything? The person needs antibiotics, not prayer. Right? And the other person wants to
Right.
say, well, no, God will heal if God
Mhm,
listens to our prayers and makes a
mhm.
judgment call. So because everything ultimately is dependent upon God,
Right.
and so you use that
Right.
different method, but that's tied to a different metaphysics.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. This is really interesting. I just want to say in defense of the Calvinist, I don't know, like the Calvinist perspective, as far as I understand it, is that the role of the Christian is to fill the predestined duty. And so in the sense that like Christ didn't he didn't come down and then go right back up because it was better up there. He came down, fulfilled the duty after 33 years, then ascended into heaven. And so I wouldn't say at least for me, like I wouldn't say that the goal for me is to try to get as many people to heaven if I were that doctor, but
Right.
rather to do the morally right thing in that spot, which would be to try to help that person, because I think that would be that's my maybe my predestined
No, no, that's
purpose.
right, and that's to raise another hugely important philosophical issue that we've not yet talked about, and that
Yeah.
is, the issue of free will and determinism.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
and
Right.
that is itself a metaphysical position,
Mm,
but it's going to have strong implications for what you understand the human being to be, right? What powers the person has, including what responsibilities the person has.
hmm
And then once you've delineated that, then there are going to be certain right ethical implications. Right? And so,
Yeah.
yeah, it does make sense. If you start from a theological position that says God is infinite, right? And that means he's infinite in all of the important directions, and he's going to be infinite in his power.
Mm,
And if he is infinite in his power, that means he has all of the power.
mm,
But if he has all of the power, then human beings cannot have any of the
power.
power,
Mm,
right? And
right.
so agency and volition
Mm,
and moral responsibility, those are all powers,
mm,
right? That
hmm
we sometimes say that human beings have, but to the extent that we augment the powers of God, we necessarily have to diminish the powers of human beings
hmm hmm
to a strong position that
hmm
would say basically everything is scripted by God, and don't take this too pejoratively, but we're really
Oh,
just puppets,
right.
right? Just doing what God wants, right, for us, or we're
Right.
like actors on a stage, and God is the
Right.
great screenwriter or script
Yeah.
writer, and
No.
we
No. I mean, those
then
are
make ourselves and make our lines right, and so
yeah,
on. Yeah.
100%
And there are
accurate. I mean,
slightly softer versions of Calvinism and other
hmm
theologies in that area that will say that God has all of the power in principle, but he delegates
mm,
some of the powers
mm,
temporarily to human beings. And so human beings will have some delimited powers for certain
mhm.
purposes for a certain
Right.
amount of time, but ultimately all of the power will go back to God. And a,
Right.
s- that's not a hardcore predestinarianism, but it's like one step removed
Yeah.
from that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and
And
that's
then
all 100% accurate. I mean, I like those are the big theological questions that I've faced and a lot of young people, Christians face. And I mean, for me, it's come down to the mystery of free agency and predestination, and that like
mhm.
in some capacity, I am responsible for my life, and in another capacity, I've been predestined to into the election,
Right. And so
and
what you
it's
then have is another chasm that
yeah,
you've created for
hmm
yourself, right?
right,
Coming from a different philosophical
right,
issue. So on the one hand, typically Christians do want to say morality is an important part of my religious package. For some
mm,
Christians, it's the most important part of
mm,
the package.
hmm
And that then is to say, I'm going to take moral responsibility very seriously.
mm,
But at the same time, one is committed to a metaphysical position about the nature of God,
mm,
that God is infinite and infinite in his knowledge, infinite in his power, and so on. But there are obviously logical tensions at the minimum and
yeah,
outright logical contradictions at the
a
worst
hundred
between
percent, right,
those. So is it possible to logically put those two commitments together, or do you have to
mm,
choose one or
hmm
the other?
hmm
And then that, of course, leads directly into epistemological issues
yeah,
about knowledge. Some people will say, well, no, the important thing is we should come up with a religious philosophy that's logical and is
mm,
logically consistent. And
hmm
so if I have a tension between saying that God has all of the power, but nonetheless, I also want to say humans have some moral power,
mm,
I have to find a way to make that logically consistent, right?
hmm
Because I'm committed to logic,
mm,
and that's an epistemological position. But then other Christians will say, I'm committed to God has all the power. I'm committed to human beings are morally
mm,
responsible. I don't see any way to make that consistent. And
mm,
so I'm going to start talking the language of mystery and the language of faith.
right,
It's just an article of
mm,
faith. I just
hmm
have to accept it and not really try to figure it out too
mm,
much. And that's to commit to a different epistemology.
hmm
Now, then, when we come back to our main topic of the day, which is education, that
mm,
is another issue that's going to have huge implications for how you educate your children.
right,
Do you teach children from the beginning that they need to be logical and rational? and train
Uh-huh.
them to be
Right.
very sensitive to any sort of logical tension or a logical contradiction in their
Mm,
thinking. And when they find one, to say, oh, there's a mistake here because things can't be illogical. And so I
right.
need to be more clever and creative at finding ways of overcoming these logical
Mm,
contradictions. And that's what you make fundamental in your educational methods.
mm,
Or does your philosophy then say, well, ultimately, things are beyond human comprehension, beyond human logic, beyond human rationality? Who am I to try to understand things?
mm,
Ultimately, everything is a mystery. And here are the truths, the 10
mm,
truths, the 20 truths that are absolutely true. And you had better
mm,
believe them. Don't ask so many questions. Don't be a troublemaker.
mhm.
And you make that a part of your educational method.
Right,
That one is
right.
also with us and in collision in how we do schooling.
So yeah, I know we got to wrap this up, but can
Yeah,
I
unfortunately,
have
yes.
uh, and tell me if you're like this is too long for me to answer. That's totally fine, no problem. Um, who should who should be the arbiters of those decisions as far as how we educate maybe ourselves, but even our children?
Yeah.
And that might be a way too big of a question.
Well,
So
that's a big question, but I can take that one up. And I think it's probably the most important question in
yeah,
education, right? Who should
right.
be the arbiter? Now, my view,
Mm.
and I'll take the last word here, since
Yeah,
I am
yeah,
the invited
yeah.
guest. Is no, I think we are individuals, right? We each have our own life to live. We have our own minds, and the ultimate responsibility for getting a good education resides with the individual.
Mm,
Now, parents do have a responsibility, educators have a responsibility to foster that when children are young. It can be crushed when kids are too young by over powerful parents and overbearing teachers and so forth.
mm,
But that is fundamentally the most important thing. I think the thing that makes human beings the wonderfully distinctive creature that they are
mm,
is that they have a capacity to take charge of their own lives, to develop their minds, to develop their bodies, and to put together their view of what life is and should be all about.
mm.
And that's the most important thing that we need to do in education. And of course, it should be a lifelong thing that we're always right on the on that process. So,
Mm,
if you answer then your question about the ultimate arbiter, I think should be each individual.
mm,
We each ultimately need to make our own decisions, what we think is true, what is false, what's valuable, what's not valuable, what's important, what's not important.
mm,
Parents, educators, and so forth can and should be providing huge amounts of guidance in that process. But the
mm,
ultimate is I am responsible for making my own decisions in life, for acting in my life on what I think is right, true, good, beautiful in the world, and hopefully living a good life and enjoying the rewards. But if I make mistakes, then I also bear the responsibility for those mistakes. So
mm,
each individual is the arbiter of their own life.
mm. Yeah. No, that makes. I mean, gosh, I wish we could talk longer. There's so many
Okay.
things, there's so many more questions, but
Well,
I really
yes.
do.
Let me then just say, this has been an enjoyable conversation, and I know
Yeah.
we only got at the very beginning of your list of questions.
No
But
problem.
let's if you're open, plan to do another one,
Yeah.
maybe toward the end of this year, the
That
end of
sounds great.
2024.
That would be
So
awesome. Yeah.
yeah, we can reboot.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I'll shoot you an email, but yeah, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I mean, this has been
Okay,
super interesting. I hope people learned a lot
great.
from this.
Okay,
Let me
pleasure. Good questions. Great start.